families of 9 Palestinian Americans stuck in Gaza are suing the Biden administration for allegedly abandoning them. Maria Kari, the lead attorney representing the plaintiffs, filed the motion on December 21st, claiming the administration discriminated against them when it left the plaintiffs trapped in a war zone. The claimants are all either US citizens, legal permanent residents, or their immediate relatives.
Despite being granted approval by the State Department to leave the territory, the 9 remain stranded because their names were left off of the final crossing list for the Rafah border, which closed on May 6th. It's unclear why they didn't make the list. The lawsuit directly names Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. It highlights a double standard. Since the October 7th Hamas attacks, the U.S. has helped to evacuate Israeli Americans and their families. When Lebanon came under Israel attack, the U.S. assisted Lebanese Americans and their families as well.
To discuss the case further and where it stands is Maria Kari herself. So joining us now. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, how are you guys?
Good, thank you. So just on the general framework of this case, the argument in essence is the Biden administration came to the aid of Israeli Americans and Lebanese Americans and not the plaintiffs who you represent. Is that correct?
That's a fair thing to say. Look, you have federal law, you have executive orders, you have an interagency agreement between the State Department and the Department of Defense. They all establish a clear and non-discretionary duty to protect and evacuate U.S. citizens. And along with that, I would say that there's also a moral imperative, right? To treat Palestinian Americans and their immediate relatives the same way that you've treated Israeli Americans and then Lebanese Americans. And these are all people who we've evacuated since last October, yet we failed to do the same for Palestinian Americans and their immediate relatives.
Do you have any knowledge of why their names were left off the list in order to make the Rafah crossing so many weeks ago? Has some excuse been given by authorities for that?
Absolutely no excuse has been given. And look, this whole process has been a black box. This is my 4th lawsuit compelling the government to do its job. The evacuation process for Americans in Gaza has been murky from the get-go. And because of that, it's resulted in a lot of family separation. It's left our plaintiffs in the dark about when and how, and if they'll ever leave Gaza. And that's really been the reason why we were compelled and we were forced to have to bring this lawsuit, because we were knocking on the doors of the elected representatives that represent our plaintiffs. We were turning to State Department officials, White House officials consistently for the last 14 months. And we were constantly met with boilerplate responses, and in some cases, a complete shutdown of all communication with some of the plaintiffs. And it was only then that we were forced to turn to the courts for relief.
When I was researching prior to this conversation, I was struck by comments you'd made elsewhere where, and of course correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you see this, I think, as emblematic of a broader failure on the Biden administration's part to really fully recognize, well, the humanity of Palestinians and Palestinian Americans. And, you know, that made me in turn think about the fact that there are, setting aside even Gaza, there are at least 3 American citizens who have been killed in the West Bank this year. 2 17-year-old boys among them, and perhaps the most notable, or notable is the wrong word, the most famous case being Aysenur Ezgi Agi, who I'm sure her name I've mispronounced, but unintentionally so. Those killings, to my mind, don't seem to have attracted the level of outrage that one would expect if the armed forces of a foreign state kill American citizens.
Look, you completely hit the nail on the head with everything you just said. I want to emphasize all of my plaintiffs are approved by their government, the US government, to leave, right? But the US government has consistently left their safety in the hands of a foreign government that has shown that it does not differentiate and does not, frankly, care for civilian life in Gaza. Now, you raise the Americans who were killed in West Bank. I'd like to point out to you that one of my own plaintiffs was killed before we could file. And he's a green card holder, a 75-year-old civilian who was sheltering with his elderly wife, and they were both hit by an Israeli bomb, and he was killed and she's gravely injured. They're green card holders from Dallas, and their daughter has been watching in horror for almost 15 months now. She's lost one parent, and now she believes that she'll lose another parent because all of my plaintiffs are frankly disillusioned at this point. And that really has been the systematic dehumanization of a group of people, not just in Gaza. This is happening here at home. And look, let's be very clear. The Americans they're global leaders in this conflict. They have immense influence over their top ally, Israel, in this area. And we've consistently seen them use that immense influence as leverage when it suits them. But why have they failed to advance the interests of their own citizens? It would be a goodwill gesture for the Biden administration to bring home these Americans to safety. Because when we talk about, and when the administration repeatedly talks about calling for a ceasefire, the safe return of American hostages, all fair and important things to call for, in the same breath it can and should talk about the safety of Americans that's abandoned in Gaza. And it has never done that to date.
It is certainly the case that this is an issue that has outraged many Arab Americans living in the U.S. who've expressed their dissatisfaction with the policy. Kamala Harris losing a lot of these voters in my home state of Michigan, for example, in communities with heavy numbers of people who have family in the region. But as you say, the Biden administration seems to have been relatively indifferent, even compared to previous administrations, on hearing out this concern and doing anything about it. So you'd think that at the very least prioritizing American citizens getting out, because the Americans being held captive by Hamas has been such and rightly so in my view, are at a sticking point by the administration that something must be done.
Look, all of our plaintiffs have suffered an incredible amount of horror and trauma at this point, whether it be mental trauma, but also physical trauma. So I have one plaintiff, Salsabil. She's a U.S. citizen. She's sheltering in place in the north of Gaza with 3 minor children. One of her children was was maimed as a result of a bomb. His back was shredded and he lost a limb. I mean, this is what's happening to Americans in Gaza, and not enough people know that this is happening. And the government, when you read the responses that they send, in response to us informing them what has happened to Americans and their immediate relatives on the ground, it's almost callous and cold and indifferent. But that complicity and that apathy should shock everybody. You say that this has been an upsetting thing for Arab Americans. I'm not Arab. I am an American, and my conscience rebels at the fact that this is happening and is being done under our government's watch. The government needs to course correct. It has only a few weeks to do the right thing here, right? The leaders need to do their job.
To that point, what happens to your case whenever the administration changes? It still can presumably proceed against, he'll be then former President Biden and Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin as individuals. It doesn't somehow become invalidated because the administration changes, right?
Absolutely not. Look, the law is the law. The law is going to stay the same. And unfortunately, my client's circumstances are going to stay as dire as they are, if not worse, under a new administration. We still have a matter of a few weeks left in this administration. We've only just filed. So I continue to hold hope for my clients on their behalf. I mentioned that they're all disillusioned and frustrated. They have lost they've lost so many people. They're all on the verge of starvation. They're all suffering from one disease or another. They're all forced to drink and bathe in unclean water, living in leaky tents. I'm holding out hope for them that this administration is going to do the right thing and that this lawsuit is going to be what it takes, unfortunately, to make this administration do the right thing.
Maria Kari, thank you so much for joining us to explain this. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.